A homeless girl accidentally saves a millionaire who was knocked unconscious in the neighborhood dump. The millionaire returns the favor by taking the girl home. But surprisingly, a few days later, his old butler is suddenly seriously injured because the girl has. The city breathed in long, tired sighs. Streetlights flickered, their weak glow swallowed by the damp air, casting half-hearted illumination over cracked sidewalks and overflowing dumpsters. The scent of rain lingered, mixing with the acrid tang of rotting food. The stale stench of cardboard beds pressed into damp pavement. A car rumbled past, its headlights carving momentary clarity into the gloom before vanishing around the corner. Jane crouched near a pile of discarded boxes, her fingers numb as she rummaged through the trash. She had learned, over the years, to be quick. Hesitation meant losing out on something useful. A half-eaten sandwich, a forgotten scarf, anything to dull the hunger or ward off the cold. The city never gave handouts, and if it did, they were always a moment too late. As she moved a broken glass bottle aside, something caught her eye, a sliver of silver, gleaming unnaturally beneath the dim alley light. Her brow furrowed as she leaned closer, her breath forming small clouds in the night air. The object wasn't metal or plastic, not the usual discarded things she had grown accustomed to seeing. It was the buckle of a leather shoe. Jane froze. At first, she thought it was just another homeless man, collapsed from exhaustion or drink. It wasn't uncommon to see bodies curled up in corners, blending into the debris. But something felt different this time. The shoes were polished, barely scuffed, attached to a pair of dark slacks that didn't belong in a place like this. A wrist peeked out from beneath a crumpled sleeve, adorned with a watch. Silver, heavy, the kind she had only ever seen through pawnshop windows. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't some drunk sleeping off a bad night. She stepped forward cautiously, her stomach tight with unease. The man's face was partially obscured by the angle of his body, but his chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. His hand twitched, fingers curling inward, as if grasping at something invisible. "Hey," she called softly, testing. No response. Her instinct told her to leave, to turn around and disappear into the night before anyone saw her. But then, a flicker of movement at the alley's mouth made her entire body go rigid. A man, cloaked in black, standing just beyond the alley's edge, watching. Her pulse quickened. He wasn't just any passerby. His stance was too rigid, his posture too controlled. He had been waiting. Waiting for what? Jane didn't stay to find out. In a single fluid motion, she pivoted on her heel, feigning a casual step forward before bursting into a sprint. Her heartbeat roared in her ears as she tore through the alley, her feet slamming against the pavement. The man reacted instantly. She heard his boots scrape against the ground as he lunged after her, his presence closing in fast. He was taller, stronger. If he caught her, it would be over. But Jane wasn't just fast. She was smart. Instead of taking the straight path toward the street, she veered sharply left, darting through the skeletal remains of an old construction site. Rusted scaffolding loomed above her, tangled wires snaking along the ground. She leaped over debris, forcing herself to think through the panic clawing at her chest. She needed to slow him down. Spotting a stack of loose pallets, she threw her weight against them, sending them toppling into the narrow path behind her. The sharp sound of wood crashing against metal echoed through the alley, followed by the muffled grunt of her pursuer skidding to a halt. Jane didn't stop to look. The main road was just ahead, its golden streetlights flickering like a beacon of salvation. 20 feet. 15. 10. She burst onto the sidewalk, nearly colliding with a man stepping out of a cafe. "Help! Someone call the police! Call an ambulance too! Someone is injured!" Her voice came out raw, desperate. Heads turned. A couple, near a food cart, paused mid-conversation. A taxi driver rolled down his window, frowning. A man pulled out his phone, his thumb already hovering over the dial. The man in black stopped short at the alley's mouth, his eyes locking with hers. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, as the wail of approaching sirens cut through the city air, he melted back into the darkness, disappearing before anyone could get a clear look. Jane stood there, chest heaving, her hands clenched into fists. Behind her, the ambulance skidded to a stop, red and blue lights washing over the alley's brick walls. Paramedics rushed forward, their voices clipped as they assessed the unconscious man on the ground. Still breathless, Jane watched as they checked his pulse, their faces momentarily tense before one of them nodded to the others. He's alive. Relief crashed into her, sudden and unexpected. She had no idea who this man was, why someone had left him there, or why a stranger had been watching from the shadows. But instinct told her she had just stepped into something far bigger than herself. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't sure if running had been the right choice. The waiting room hummed with the quiet sounds of exhaustion. A vending machine flickered near the corner, its dim glow reflecting off the freshly mopped floors. The rhythmic beeping of machines filtered in from beyond the hallway, blending with the low murmur of hushed conversations. The air smelled sterile, thick with disinfectant, as though the place had been scrubbed of anything human. Jane sat on a plastic chair near the entrance, arms wrapped around her knees, watching the automatic doors slide open and shut. People came and went, nurses with hurried steps, families whispering in worried tones. But she remained still, unnoticed. She should leave. It wasn't her place to be here. The man, Antonio White, they had called him, was a stranger. She had done what she could. The rest wasn't her problem. And yet, something kept her there, her gaze flicking to the hallway where they had taken him. She replayed the night in her mind. The suit, the watch, the alley. No one dressed like that ended up near a garbage heap by accident. The man in black, the way he had stood, not just watching, but waiting. They hadn't meant to kill Antonio outright. If they had, he would be a body in the morgue, not a patient in recovery. No, they had dragged him there for a reason. The trash heaps, the shadows, the deserted streets. It was a place where no one would look, where time could stretch dangerously long before anyone found him. She exhaled sharply, pressing her fingers against her temples. Whatever this was, it wasn't random, and that meant whoever had left him there wouldn't just disappear. A voice startled her. "You were the one who called for help, right?" Jane looked up to see a nurse, her expression unreadable. For a second, Jane considered lying, saying she had just been passing by. But what was the point? She nodded. The nurse's face softened. "He's awake." Jane hesitated before standing, trailing behind her down the hallway. The smell of antiseptic grew stronger as they moved past rooms with half-drawn curtains, glimpses of tired faces and restless sleep behind them. The nurse pushed open a door, stepping aside. Inside, under the harsh glow of hospital lighting, Antonio White lay in bed, his face pale against crisp white sheets. His suit jacket was gone, replaced by a hospital gown that made him look strangely vulnerable. He stared at the ceiling, his expression unreadable. Jane hovered near the door, unsure if she should enter. Then his gaze shifted to her. His eyes were sharp despite the exhaustion, assessing, calculating. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then his voice, hoarse but steady. "You were there?" Jane nodded, stepping closer but not too close. "Yeah." His eyes searched her face as if trying to place her. "You called the ambulance?" "Someone had to." A faint smile ghosted across his lips. "I suppose I should thank you." She shrugged, shoving her hands into her jacket pockets. "Don't mention it." The door clicked shut behind her, leaving them alone. The steady hum of the heart monitor filled the silence between them. Antonio exhaled, shifting slightly, wincing at the effort. "What happened?" Jane hesitated before answering. "I think someone wanted you out of the way." His gaze sharpened. "Out of the way?" "You weren't just attacked. You were dumped." She met his eyes. "They left you in the worst possible place. Somewhere no one would notice you for hours." Antonio didn't react immediately. He let the words settle, turning them over in his mind. "Someone planned this," Jane continued. "They knew what they were doing." Antonio looked away, his fingers curling slightly against the blanket. "Did you see who did it?" "Not his face," she admitted, "but I saw him." He turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "Tell me everything." She did. The way the man in black had stood in the alley, waiting, not surprised to see her there. The way he had moved, not panicked, not rushed. How he had only reacted when she ran, as if deciding in that moment whether or not she was worth chasing. Antonio listened. His silence weighted with thought. Finally, he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. This wasn't random. No kidding. He gave a tired chuckle at that, then grimaced. Not the best time to laugh. Jane shifted on her feet, suddenly unsure of what else to say. "Look, I just wanted to make sure you were okay. That's all." She took a step back, ready to leave. But before she could reach the door, Antonio spoke. "You don't have anywhere to go, do you?" Her spine stiffened. She turned, eyes narrowing slightly. "Why do you care?" Antonio didn't flinch. "Because I owe you." Jane scoffed. "You don't owe me anything." "Maybe not," he agreed. "But it doesn't change the fact that you don't have a place to go." Jane hesitated, fingers curling into her jacket sleeves. For years, she had lived by an unspoken rule. Never accept favors. Favors came with expectations, with strings, with the kind of debt that couldn't always be paid in cash. Antonio White didn't seem like the kind of man who offered things freely. And yet, there was no condescension in his tone, no pity, just a statement of fact. She exhaled, glancing toward the door. "I'll think about it," she muttered. Antonio didn't press further, but as she walked out, she had the strange feeling that, for the first time in a long time, someone was watching. Not because they wanted something from her, but because, for whatever reason, they cared. The night air outside the hospital was heavy, thick with the lingering scent of rain. The city lights flickered in the distance, neon signs casting long shadows against wet pavement. The streets, once loud with passing cars and hurried footsteps, had settled into a hushed stillness. Jane stood near the curb, hands shoved deep into the pockets of her worn jacket, her breath curling in the cold. She could still feel the weight of Antonio's words pressing against her. "You don't have anywhere to go, do you?" She had considered lying, brushing him off with some half-hearted excuse, but in the end, she hadn't answered. Maybe because she knew he already saw through it. Now, as she lingered between staying and slipping away into the city's vast, indifferent sprawl, a sleek, black car rolled to a stop in front of her. The passenger window lowered, revealing Antonio in the back seat. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, observant. "Get in," he said, voice calm, certain. Jane hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "I didn't say yes." Antonio exhaled, something close to amusement flickering across his face. "You didn't say no either." Silence stretched between them. The car idled, waiting. Her body ached from exhaustion. Her stomach clenched at the thought of a warm meal. Her mind raced with every reason she shouldn't trust him, shouldn't accept. But in the end, Survival had always outweighed pride. With a sigh, Jane pulled the door open and slid into the seat, the leather cold beneath her fingertips. The ride was quiet. She kept her hands in her lap, fingers fidgeting with a loose thread on her sleeve. The car smelled clean, expensive, like leather and faint traces of cologne. It felt foreign, too refined for someone like her, like something she might wake up from if she closed her eyes too long. Antonio, seated beside her, didn't push conversation. He seemed to understand the weight of silence, the unspoken rules of someone who had learned to keep her guard up. But every so often, Jane felt his gaze flick toward her, as if trying to figure out what kind of person she was beneath the layers of wariness. As they turned onto a private road, the cityscape gave way to something quieter, grander. The gates ahead opened smoothly as the car rolled forward, revealing a sprawling estate bathed in the soft glow of warm lights. The mansion stood tall, elegant, its grand entrance lined with neatly trimmed hedges and stone pathways. Jane tensed. This wasn't just a house. It was the kind of place where people had power, where no one ever had to wonder where their next meal would come from. It was the kind of place she never belonged. The car came to a slow stop in the circular driveway. As she stepped out, she felt small against the vastness of it all. The high ceilings, the polished marble floors, the quiet hum of wealth that pressed against the air. Before she could process it, a woman appeared at the entrance. Older, with sharp eyes that softened only slightly at the sight of Antonio. She took in Jane's presence with a single sweep of her gaze, her expression unreadable. "Who's this?" "Megan," Antonio said, stepping past Jane. "This is Jane. She's staying the night." The woman, Megan, clearly someone of authority in this house, narrowed her eyes slightly. "The night?" Jane bristled, already feeling like an unwelcome guest. She forced her shoulders back, lifting her chin slightly. "I won't be here long," she muttered. Megan said nothing for a moment. Then, with a sigh, she turned on her heel. "Come on then. You look like you could use a meal." Jane followed reluctantly, though the promise of food pulled her forward. The dining room was overwhelming. Long table, fine china, chandeliers casting warm light across dark wood. It was the kind of setting where people used silverware properly, where meals came in courses rather than scraps found in a paper bag. She sat stiffly, hyper-aware of the way Antonio watched her from across the table. When the first plate was placed in front of her, steaming, rich with unfamiliar spices, she hesitated, waiting for someone to tell her she wasn't allowed. When no one did, she picked up her fork and took a careful bite. She had planned to eat slowly, to show restraint, but the moment the first bite hit her tongue, her body betrayed her. She hadn't had a real meal in days, maybe longer. She tried to pace herself, but hunger won over dignity, her movements quick, efficient, barely stopping to breathe between bites. When she finally slowed, she realized Antonio was watching, not with judgment, but something quieter. Amusement maybe, understanding. She set her fork down, swallowing hard. "What?" Antonio leaned back in his chair. "Nothing." She narrowed her eyes. "You're staring." He smirked. "I've just never seen anyone eat like they're expecting the plate to vanish." Jane scowled, but didn't argue. He wasn't wrong. Megan returned a few minutes later, leading Jane away from the table. Upstairs, the guest room was too big, too polished. The bed looked untouched, its sheets smooth and inviting, the kind of softness that felt undeserved. Jane hovered near the door, uncertain. "You can lock it if you want," Megan said from the hallway. "No one's going to bother you." Jane hesitated, then nodded. "Thanks." As the door clicked shut, she stood in the center of the room, taking in the stillness. No street noise, no distant shouting, no fear of what the next morning might bring. It felt unnatural. She crawled onto the bed, stiff at first, then slowly relaxing into the unfamiliar warmth. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't lying on concrete. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't cold. Sleep found her quicker than she expected. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the hallway, mingling with the faint warmth of early morning light spilling through the tall windows. Somewhere in the distance, a grandfather clock chimed, its deep, measured tones counting the quiet moments before the house fully woke. Jane stirred, her body stiff from a kind of sleep she wasn't used to, one uninterrupted by cold air biting at her skin or the distant hum of restless city streets. For a moment, she wasn't sure where she was. The bed was too soft, the air too still. Then she remembered. The mansion, the dinner, the way Antonio had watched her without pity. She exhaled slowly, rolling onto her side. It should have been comforting. Instead, it was unnerving. Then she heard voices. Muffled, low, the kind of conversation people had when they didn't want to be overheard. Jane slipped out of bed, padding silently toward the door. She eased it open just enough to see down the hallway. The voices were coming from the study at the end of the corridor. She moved carefully, sticking to the edges of the polished wooden floor, her instincts sharpened from years of navigating places she wasn't supposed to be. The door to the study was slightly ajar. "You're certain?" Antonio's voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it, something taut and controlled. A second voice responded, lower, measured. "He knew exactly where you'd be. That wasn't coincidence." A pause. Then Antonio sighed. "And no leads on who sent him." Jane's pulse quickened. A chair scraped against the floor. "Not yet. But if someone wanted you dead, they wouldn't have left you breathing." Another silence. Then Antonio's voice, quieter this time. "They wanted time." Jane frowned. Time for what? Before she could listen further, a floorboard groaned beneath her weight. She barely had time to curse herself before Antonio's voice cut through the air. "You can come in, Jane." She hesitated, then pushed the door open. Antonio sat behind an oak desk, phone still in hand, his sharp eyes meeting hers with something unreadable. Across from him, a man in his 40s leaned back in a chair, assessing her with a curious tilt of his head. He was dressed in dark slacks and a crisp button-up, sleeves rolled to his elbows. Not a businessman. A detective, maybe, or something worse. The man glanced at Antonio. "This her?" Antonio gave a slow nod. "Jane, meet Carter. He's—" "I get it," Jane cut in. "Private investigator." Carter smirked, amused. "Smart girl." She ignored the remark, stepping closer. "What did you mean about time?" Antonio studied her for a beat before responding. "Whoever left me in that alley didn't want me dead. Not immediately, at least." Carter nodded. "They dumped you somewhere no one would look right away. The garbage heaps, the darkness. It wasn't an accident. Someone needed time before you were found." Jane crossed her arms. Time to do what? Neither of them had an answer. Antonio exhaled, rubbing his temple. "We need to figure out who benefits from this. Someone who wants me out of the way but not gone completely." He turned to his desk, pulling out a folder. "I put together a list." He slid it toward Jane, names printed neatly in rows, some underlined, some circled. Business rivals, former associates, people with grudges. Jane scanned the list. None of them looked familiar. She shook her head. "I don't recognize any of these people." Antonio's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of frustration in his eyes. He had hoped for something, anything, that would give him direction. Carter stood, slipping his hands into his pockets. "I'll keep digging." He glanced at Jane. "If you remember anything else, even the smallest detail, let him know." Jane didn't respond, watching as the investigator strode toward the door. He paused, looking back at Antonio. "Be careful. Whoever's behind this, they're not done." The study door clicked shut behind him. For a long moment, neither Jane nor Antonio spoke. Then Antonio sighed, leaning back in his chair. "We'll figure it out." Jane narrowed her eyes. "You don't sound convinced?" His lips quirked, but there was little humor in it. "I just prefer having a clearer target." She sat across from him, resting her elbows on her knees. "So, what now?" "Now?" Antonio glanced at the list again before closing the folder. "We wait for the next move." The rest of the day passed in strange quiet. Jane still wasn't sure if she was a guest or a stray Antonio had taken in for the night, but no one had told her to leave. Megan, despite her initial skepticism, had softened. It was in the small things, an extra serving at lunch, a folded blanket left at the foot of her bed. She still didn't trust it. Kindness was always followed by conditions. Still, as she sat in the kitchen that evening, stirring the remnants of soup in her bowl, she caught Antonio watching her from across the table. "What?" she asked. He didn't answer right away, his gaze steady. Then, finally, "You're not planning on running, are you?" Jane smirked, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Would it matter if I did?" Antonio studied her, something unreadable in his expression. "Yes." She wasn't sure how to respond to that. So, she said nothing. Sunlight stretched across the grand hall, filtering through the towering windows and casting long, golden streaks on the polished floors. The air carried a distinct warmth, clean linen, fresh coffee, and the faintest trace of old paper from the study. The mansion always had an eerie kind of stillness in the mornings, as though it were waiting for its occupants to decide what kind of day it would be. Jane had begun to adjust to the rhythm of the house, but she never truly let her guard down. The walls were too pristine, the air too still, and the security too tight. A place like this didn't just exist without reason. It was built, protected, and reinforced. For now, it was her temporary shelter. Nothing more. She moved quietly down the corridor, fingers trailing along the carved banister as she passed. The scent of paper and ink caught her attention. Antonio's study door was slightly ajar, the crack just wide enough for her to glimpse the inside. Stacks of documents lay scattered across the desk, a half-finished cup of coffee resting dangerously close to the edge. And on top of the mess, a newspaper lay open, its pages crisp and unwrinkled. Jane hadn't meant to stop. She hadn't meant to look. But then she saw it. The article itself was nothing unusual, just another business feature highlighting power players in the city. The headline praised an industry leader, a self-made millionaire, Stephen Allen, the man who built an empire. Jane barely registered the name. Her eyes were locked onto the photograph beneath it. A handshake. Two rich men are standing side by side at an event, cameras flashing. One of them was Stephen, dressed in an expensive suit, smiling like he owned the world. But it wasn't him that made Jane's stomach twist. It was the man standing near him. He just happened to get into the lens. The man in black. The same one who had chased her through the alley that night. The breath hitched in her throat. Her fingers curled against the doorway as something hot and sharp coiled in her chest. She turned on her heel, moving fast, faster than she should have, her footsteps carrying her down the hallway before she could stop herself. Antonio was in the sitting room, flipping through paperwork, his expression blank with deep thought. He barely glanced up when Jane entered, until she dropped the newspaper in front of him. "Tell me this is a coincidence," she said, voice low, tense. Antonio frowned, his gaze flicking to the page before him. She saw the moment it registered. His entire body went still. Jane watched as his usually composed expression cracked for the first time since she'd met him. His jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the paper just a fraction too hard. It took him several seconds to speak. "Where did you find this?" "In your study." Jane crossed her arms. "I wasn't snooping, I just—" She hesitated, shaking her head. "It doesn't matter. That's him. The guy who was in the alley. The one who chased me." Antonio didn't move. His breath was steady, but his hands betrayed him, clenching, tightening, as though he were holding something back. Finally, he exhaled, his voice quiet, controlled. "That's not possible." Jane let out a humorless laugh. "I saw him. I know it's him." Antonio lifted his gaze, something unreadable behind his eyes. "Jane, Stephen isn't just a business acquaintance." She narrowed her eyes. "He's my friend." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Jane felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Well," she said slowly, "your friend had a bodyguard trying to make sure you never woke up again." Antonio's fingers curled tighter around the newspaper. "No." He shook his head, as if saying it out loud would make it true. "Not Stephen." Jane's patience thinned. "Then explain why this guy was there. Why was he the one watching you? Why did he chase me?" Antonio didn't answer. She could see the war in his eyes, the way his mind worked through it, fighting against something he didn't want to believe. Loyalty, trust, years of friendship, and yet, evidence, facts. The undeniable truth is staring him in the face. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand down his face. "I need to think," he muttered. Jane scoffed. "You need to open your eyes." Antonio didn't react, not immediately. But when he finally looked at her, there was something different in his expression. Something heavier. "I'll handle it." Jane studied him for a moment, before shaking her head. "You better. Because if you don't, whoever did this is just going to try again." She turned and walked away, leaving the newspaper on the table, its pages still open, still damning. Antonio sat in silence, staring at the name, the face of a man he had called a friend. And for the first time, doubt crept in. Antonio locked himself in his study, the heavy oak door shut behind him with a quiet finality, blocking out the rest of the world. The weight of the newspaper still lingered in his hands, but he could barely bring himself to look at it. His thoughts tangled, looping in circles, trying to rationalize the impossible. Stephen. Not just a friend, his closest confidant. The man who had stood by his side for years, who had toasted his victories and consoled his failures. The man who had been there when Antonio's father died, when he took over the company, when he fought through sleepless nights, building everything from the ground up. And yet, Jane had seen his bodyguard in that alley. Antonio pulled out his laptop and scrolled through security logs, past financial reports, past every scheduled meeting with Stephen in the last 6 months. His mind searched for cracks, inconsistencies, anything that might explain this away. Nothing. No late-night warnings, no whispered doubts, no sudden distance. Stephen had played his part well. The betrayal was almost surgical in its precision. Antonio clenched his jaw, shoving the laptop aside before he did something reckless, like hurl it across the room. Outside the study, Jane felt the shift. The house, already too quiet, now held an edge of something heavier. She saw it in the way Antonio carried himself, his usual composed demeanor slightly frayed at the edges, his movements more deliberate, his silences longer. He didn't talk to her that night. The next morning, he barely touched his coffee, staring at his phone screen as though willing it to tell him something he didn't already know. Even Megan, sharp-eyed and perceptive, had noticed. Some wounds take time, she had told Jane, but Jane knew better. Some wounds didn't heal. Some festered. By midday, Antonio finally made his move. Carter picked up after the first ring. "I need more," Antonio said, voice even. Carter didn't ask for details. He understood the weight behind those words. "Tell me what you need." Antonio leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Stephen Allen, everything." A pause. Then Carter hummed, a sound that carried a quiet kind of acknowledgement. "You sure you want that?" Antonio's grip tightened around the phone. "I need to know if I'm wrong." Another pause. "I'll get back to you," Carter said, before the line went dead. Antonio set the phone down, staring at it like it might offer something else. Something easier. But there was nothing easy about this. The waiting was unbearable. Jane tried to ignore it, tried to mind her own business, but the truth itched under her skin. By the third day, she had had enough. She found Antonio in the sitting room, staring out at the garden with an untouched drink in his hand. "You gonna tell me what you found out?" she asked, arms crossed. Antonio didn't turn. "I don't have answers yet," Jane scoffed. "You're just hoping the ones you get aren't the ones you already know." A muscle in his jaw twitched. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "If he's guilty, you know what that means, right?" Antonio's gaze remained locked on the horizon. "I know." Jane exhaled, something between frustration and reluctant sympathy threading through her voice. "Then stop stalling!" A knock interrupted them. Antonio turned sharply. Jane followed his gaze as Megan appeared at the doorway, her expression unreadable. "There's a call for you," she said simply. Antonio's stomach twisted. He already knew who it was. Carter's voice was steady, impassive. "I have your answer." Antonio closed his eyes briefly, inhaling through his nose. "Tell me." A beat of silence. Then, "Stephen's clean." Antonio's heart twisted, but before relief could settle, Carter continued. "On paper." Antonio stilled. Carter exhaled. "No direct links, no financial trails, but..." "But," Antonio repeated, voice clipped. "There's a pattern. People tied to him, people who disappeared under convenient circumstances, deals that fell apart because the other party suddenly backed out, companies that should have thrived but collapsed at just the right time for him to step in." Carter paused. "And that bodyguard?" "The one Jane saw. He's not just some security detail. He's been in the shadows for years, cleaning up loose ends." Antonio's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned white. "Stephen's too careful," Carter continued. "He doesn't get his hands dirty. But he's the kind of man who always wins. And when someone like that never loses, you have to start asking why." Silence. Antonio swallowed down the bitter taste in his throat. "Send me everything," he said quietly. Another pause. Then Carter murmured, "I'm sorry, man." Antonio hung up. The room felt too big, too empty, the air too heavy with something he couldn't quite name. Jane stood in the doorway, watching. "You got what you needed?" she asked. Antonio didn't answer right away. Then, voice quieter than before, he said, "I got what I already knew." Jane studied him. "Then what are you going to do about it?" Antonio didn't look at her, but deep inside, he already knew the answer. The city was quieter in the early afternoon, the lull between the morning rush and the evening frenzy. The streets carried the scent of fresh bread from a bakery a few doors down, mixing with the faint aroma of rain from the night before. Jane walked beside Megan, her hands tucked into the pockets of her hoodie, absorbing the details of the world around her. It was a strange feeling, existing in a space that wasn't a constant fight for survival. The rhythm of the sidewalks, the small talk of strangers passing by, and even the weight of the shopping bags Megan carried. It was all unfamiliar. Megan, oblivious to Jane's guarded thoughts, filled the silence with stories. "You know, Antonio wasn't always like this," she said as they crossed the street. "Years ago he had a different air about him, a little more reckless, a little less guarded. But success changes people. Loss does too." Jane glanced at her. "Loss?" Megan nodded. "His father, the business, the people who tried to take it from him." She sighed. "It does something to a person, learning how many hands would rather pull you down than lift you up." Jane mulled over that. She didn't know why she cared, but a part of her, some deep, unspoken part, understood what it meant to never fully trust the ground beneath your feet. They reached the small store on the corner, the door chiming as Megan pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and freshly stocked produce. It wasn't a high-end supermarket, just a neighborhood place where people knew each other by name. Jane followed Megan as she navigated the aisles, picking out essentials with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Jane, on the other hand, couldn't remember the last time she had been in a store without worrying about how to get past the register without paying. "You ever cook?" Megan asked, tossing a bag of rice into the cart. Jane shrugged. "When I had food to cook." Megan hummed. "Maybe I'll teach you something while you're here. I don't imagine Antonio knows his way around a kitchen." Jane snorted. "I'd pay to see him try." Megan chuckled, shaking her head as she turned down the next aisle. It was such a simple thing, a shared moment, a brief crack in Jane's ever-present defenses. She wasn't sure how to feel about it. By the time they stepped back outside, the sky had started to shift, a pale grey creeping into the late afternoon. And then, everything changed. The van came out of nowhere, the screech of tires, the sudden lurch of movement. Jane barely had time to register the dark vehicle before the doors flew open and figures in black poured out. She moved instinctively, stepping back, reaching for Megan. But they were fast. A pair of strong hands grabbed her arm, jerking her backward. She twisted, her heart slamming into her ribs as she tried to break free. Megan's voice rang out, a shout of fury rather than fear, as she lunged toward Jane, her hands clawing at one of the men. One of them shoved Megan hard. She stumbled, hitting the pavement with a thud that sent a sharp bolt of panic through Jane's chest. "Megan!" Jane kicked, her heel catching one of her attackers in the shin. He grunted, but didn't loosen his grip. Another man grabbed her other arm. She thrashed, fighting with every ounce of strength she had, but they were bigger, stronger. Megan tried to rise, her breath ragged. "Antonio!" she gasped out, and then something hard struck the back of Jane's head, a blinding pain. Her knees buckled. The world tilted. The last thing she saw was Megan's pale face, her lips forming Antonio's name in a desperate, strained cry. Then darkness swallowed everything. Antonio felt the shift before he got the call. It was an instinct he'd long since learned to trust, an eerie stillness in the air, a weight pressing against his chest, as if the world itself was bracing for impact. When his phone rang, he already knew. Megan's voice was weak, barely above a whisper. They took her. Antonio's body went cold. "Where are you?" "The store. A cough, a pained inhale. They got Jane." His grip on the phone tightened. "Who?" I don't know. Black van, 3 men. Antonio was already moving, his steps sharp and purposeful. "Megan, listen to me. Are you hurt?" A pause. "I'll live." "Good. Because right now, Jane needed him more." Antonio ended the call and dialed Carter without missing a beat. "Antonio." "She's gone." Silence. Then Carter's voice, steel-edged and precise. Where? Antonio grabbed his car keys, already heading for the door. I don't know, but find out. Carter didn't waste time on questions. On it! Antonio pushed through the front doors of the mansion, his movements cold, controlled. But underneath, beneath the surface of every carefully measured breath, rage simmered. Someone had just made the worst mistake of their life. Antonio didn't knock. The moment he stormed through the doors of Stephen's office, the room tensed. The receptionist barely had time to register his presence before he pushed past her, his steps measured, but seething with purpose. Sir, Mr. Allen is in a meeting. Antonio didn't break stride. Stephen's office door swung open under the force of his shove. Inside, Stephen sat at his desk, a neat pile of paperwork in front of him, his expression momentarily caught between surprise and irritation. Antonio, where is she? The demand cut through the room, slicing through the air like steel. Stephen blinked. Excuse me. Antonio advanced, both hands pressing onto the polished desk. Jane. His voice was cold, deadly. Where the hell is she? Stephen leaned back slightly, his fingers threading together. A small, amused smile played on his lips. I have no idea what you're talking about. Liar. Antonio could see it in the way Stephen's jaw twitched, in the slight flicker of amusement that never quite reached his eyes. Don't play games with me, Antonio growled. I know you ordered it. I know your man was in that alley the night I was left for dead. I know you had Jane taken. Stephen sighed, shaking his head as if disappointed. Antonio, you're letting paranoia get the best of you. You always were too trusting, but now... He let out a low chuckle. Now, it seems you've swung too far in the other direction. Antonio grabbed the edge of the desk, his patience thinning by the second. I swear, if you don't tell me where she is... Stephen's smile faded, his own posture stiffening. And then, so subtly Antonio almost missed it, something shifted in his eyes. A flicker of satisfaction, of control. Stephen leaned forward, his voice lowering to something almost conversational. You stole everything from me, he murmured. Antonio stilled. Stephen's expression didn't waver. Do you even realize it? Or has your charmed life made you blind? He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. You never had to try. Everything fell into place for you. Your father's empire, the business, the success, the trust people gave you without question. His voice hardened. Even her. Antonio's stomach twisted. Her? Stephen let out a humorless laugh. Amber. Amber. The name hit Antonio like a weight to the chest. Amber Rivera. Amber, the woman Stephen had loved, the woman who, for a brief moment in time, had been drawn to Antonio instead. The woman Antonio had turned away because he had never loved her the way Stephen had. The woman who had died in a car crash. Stephen's voice was quiet now, but there was venom in it, deep and burning. She loved you, even when you didn't want her. And when she realized she'd never have you, it broke her. She lost control. And then she lost everything. His jaw clenched. And you? You walked away untouched, like you always do. Antonio exhaled sharply, realization settling like ice in his veins. This is about her. Stephen's eyes darkened. This is about everything. Antonio stepped back, forcing himself to breathe through the growing rage. So, that's what this is, he said, voice low. Punishment. Revenge. Stephen's lips curled into something almost pitying. You don't deserve to have everything, Antonio. And now, he tilted his head. You don't. Antonio's fingers twitched at his side. Where is Jane? Stephen leaned back, amusement flickering across his features once more. You want to save her? He let out a breathy laugh. "Then you better hurry." Antonio didn't think. He moved. Faster than Stephen anticipated, his hand shot across the desk, grabbing the front of Stephen's expensive suit jacket and yanking him forward. The chair screeched against the floor. For the first time, Stephen's composure cracked. "Tell me where she is," Antonio hissed, his grip tight. Stephen's smirk wavered, but it didn't disappear. "You'll find out soon enough." Antonio's grip tightened before he let go, shoving Stephen back into his chair. Without another word, he turned and strode out, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. As he stepped into the hallway, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Carter. Antonio answered without preamble. "Tell me you have something." Carter's voice was sharp, urgent. "We found her." Antonio's steps quickened. "Where?" Carter rattled off an address. A warehouse, industrial district, far from the city's watchful eyes. Antonio clenched his jaw, moving toward his car. "I'm on my way." As he slid into the driver's seat, his mind was already racing ahead. Stephen had made a mistake, and Antonio was going to make damn sure he paid for it. The city blurred past Antonio in streaks of neon and darkness, the roads stretching ahead like a lifeline. His grip on the wheel was iron-tight, his pulse a steady drumbeat of rage and urgency. Every second counted. Carter's voice echoed in his mind. Warehouse? Industrial district. Far from the city's watchful eyes. A place where no one would hear her scream. Antonio pressed the accelerator, weaving through traffic with reckless precision. The thought of Jane, alone, trapped, at the mercy of Stephen's men, was unbearable. And Stephen. Antonio had seen it in his eyes, the smug satisfaction, the cruel amusement. He'd orchestrated this. He'd wanted Antonio to run, to be desperate, to know exactly what it felt like to lose control. Antonio clenched his jaw. Not this time. Antonio killed the headlights as he approached, rolling the car to a silent stop a few blocks away. The building loomed ahead, rusted metal and shattered windows, painting a grim picture. The air smelled of damp concrete and oil, the silence suffocating. A single black van was parked outside, the same van Megan had described. His blood burned. He pressed a finger to the earpiece Carter had given him earlier. "I'm here." Carter's voice crackled through. 2 men at the front entrance, another circling the perimeter. Jackson is inside with Jane. Antonio didn't hesitate. "How long until backup?" 5 minutes, maybe less. "But you won't wait, will you?" Antonio was already moving. "No." Carter sighed. "Figured. Try not to get yourself killed." Antonio didn't answer. He crept along the shadows, his footsteps soundless against the pavement. The 2 men at the entrance stood casually, one smoking, the other scrolling through his phone. Sloppy. Antonio moved fast. He grabbed the first man by the collar, slamming his head against the metal door frame before he could react. The second man turned, eyes widening, just as Antonio drove his fist into his gut. A sharp elbow to the temple sent him crumpling to the ground. Antonio stepped over them without a second thought. He pushed open the door, slipping inside. The interior was dark, lit only by a few dim overhead bulbs. The space was mostly empty, scattered crates, old machinery, the faint scent of mold. Then he heard it. A voice. Low, amused. "Little street rat, you really are a fighter." Antonio's chest tightened. "Jackson." He followed the voice, pressing against the cold metal walls as he moved deeper. Then he saw them. Jane was on her knees, arms tied behind her back, a split lip staining her chin red. Jackson stood over her, rolling his shoulders like he was getting ready for a final blow. Antonio saw red. "Hey!" Jackson turned just in time for Antonio's fist to collide with his jaw. The force sent him stumbling back, but he recovered fast, shaking it off with a grin. "Well, well," Jackson sneered, rubbing his chin. "Look who finally showed up." Antonio didn't waste words. He lunged. Jackson was bigger, stronger. But Antonio had something else. Pure, unfiltered rage. They crashed against a stack of crates, sending wood splintering around them. Jackson swung, knuckles grazing Antonio's ribs, but Antonio barely felt it. He drove his knee into Jackson's stomach, followed by a sharp uppercut. Jackson spat blood, eyes narrowing. "You fight like a businessman." Antonio didn't respond. He just hit harder. The fight was brutal. Every punch, every strike was fueled by something deeper. Years of trust shattered. The weight of betrayal, the desperation of knowing Jane's life was on the line. Jackson staggered, but refused to go down. He reached for something, a knife. Antonio reacted without thinking. He grabbed Jackson's wrist, twisting sharply. The blade clattered to the ground. Then, with a final strike to the side of his head, Jackson collapsed. Antonio stood over him, breathing hard. Behind him, Jane coughed. "Took you long enough." Antonio turned, kneeling to untie her. "You okay?" She nodded, though her voice was hoarse. "Been through worse." He helped her to her feet, just as the distant wail of sirens filled the air. The cops. Carter hadn't been lying about backup. Within seconds, the warehouse doors burst open, officers swarming inside. Antonio stepped back as they secured the scene, his pulse still pounding. Jane swayed slightly, but Antonio caught her elbow, steadying her. "It's over," he murmured. She exhaled shakily. "For now." As the officers dragged Jackson away, Antonio turned to face the night sky, his mind already shifting to the next battle. Stephen. This wasn't over. Not yet. The interrogation room smelled of stale coffee and burnt-out cigarettes, the air thick with the weight of too many confessions, too many last chances gone wrong. Jackson sat slumped in the metal chair, his face bruised and bloodied, wrists bound in steel cuffs. He was a man who had spent his life fighting. But tonight, he had lost. Antonio stood on the other side of the glass, arms crossed, watching through the one-way mirror. The door opened behind him. Carter stepped in, a file in hand, his expression unreadable. "He's talking," Carter said simply. Antonio exhaled. He had expected it. Jackson was tough, but he wasn't the mastermind. He was a soldier, one that had been backed into a corner. "What did he say?" Antonio asked. Carter flipped open the file, scanning the report. Stephen gave the order, directly. He paused, then added, "Didn't even try to cover his tracks this time." Antonio's jaw tightened. "He had Jane taken to force your hand," Carter continued. "Wanted to push you into a mistake, into a desperate move. And if you didn't come for her?" He shrugged. "She wouldn't have left that warehouse alive." Antonio swallowed hard. He already knew all of this. He had seen it in Stephen's eyes, in the way he had taunted him, dared him to run out of time. But hearing it aloud, having it confirmed, it set something cold and final in his chest. "It's enough," Carter said, closing the file. "Stephen's finished." Antonio didn't move. Carter watched him for a moment, then sighed. "I know what you're thinking." Antonio turned his gaze toward the glass again, watching Jackson, his head now tilted down in exhaustion. "He was your friend." Antonio clenched his jaw. "No," he said quietly. "He stopped being my friend a long time ago." The police moved fast. Stephen's office was surrounded within the hour, the flashing lights of patrol cars painting the building in streaks of red and blue. Officers stormed through the entrance, guns raised, barking orders. Antonio arrived just in time to watch it unfold. He stood outside, the cold air biting at his skin, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. Carter was beside him, speaking into a radio, relaying orders. Then, silence. A different kind of stillness. Something was wrong. Antonio felt it before he saw it. A murmur moved through the officers inside. Then, as if in slow motion, one of them appeared at the doorway, shaking his head. His expression wasn't one of victory. Antonio didn't wait. He pushed past them, striding through the lobby, past the grand desk where Stephen's receptionist sat, her face pale and unreadable, up the elevator, down the hall, to the door that had once been familiar, but now felt like a tomb. He stepped inside. Stephen was slumped over his desk, his head resting against the polished wood, his dark suit wrinkled, tie slightly loosened. The once pristine order of his office was broken by a single, out-of-place detail, an empty vial. Antonio's breath came slow and measured, though inside, something twisted. He had expected justice, a trial, the weight of Stephen's actions coming back to crush him. But this wasn't justice. It was an ending. He took another step closer, his eyes scanning the desk. A single envelope sat beside Stephen's still hand. Antonio reached for it, his fingers brushing against the paper. His name was written across the front. His throat tightened as he unfolded the letter inside. Antonio, you always win. Enjoy your victory. The words were short, simple. There was no apology, no justification. Just the final, bitter sentiment of a man who had lost everything. Antonio closed his eyes briefly. Then he folded the letter, tucking it into his pocket before turning away. He didn't look back. The night air was quiet outside the precinct. Jane sat on the steps, arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the street. The bruises on her face were starting to fade, but there was still a tightness around her eyes, a lingering weight she hadn't shaken off yet. Antonio stepped up beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jane exhaled. So? Antonio slipped his hands into his coat pockets. It's over. She didn't ask for details. Maybe she didn't want them. Maybe she already knew. Instead, she just let out a small, tired laugh. Good. A car pulled up along the curb, Carter's. He rolled down the window, giving Antonio a knowing look. You coming? Antonio glanced at Jane. She met his gaze, something cautious and unreadable in her expression. For a long time, she had been running, from the past, from people, from places she never belonged. But tonight, she was still. And Antonio, for the first time in years, felt still too. He looked back at Carter. No, he said. Carter smirked. Figured. The car pulled away, leaving the two of them under the glow of the street lamp. Jane shifted. You don't have to... I know. A pause. Then quietly, she asked, So what now? Antonio sighed, tilting his head toward the city. I don't know. Jane nodded, almost to herself. Yeah, me neither. And for the first time, that was okay. The morning sun crept through the tall windows of Antonio's mansion, casting golden light across the pristine floors. The house was quiet, but not in the way Jane was used to. It wasn't the silence of loneliness, of an empty stomach and cold nights. It was steady, warm, something almost like peace. She stood by the window, fingers curled around a steaming mug of tea. The weight of the past few weeks lingered in her bones, but today felt different, lighter. Behind her, soft footsteps echoed against the polished wood. She didn't have to turn to know it was Antonio. He had a particular way of moving, controlled, deliberate. He stepped beside her, holding an envelope. Thick, official-looking. The kind of thing that usually meant bad news, but this time, it didn't. Paperwork came in, he said simply, offering it to her. Jane hesitated before taking it. The weight of it felt heavier than it should. She didn't have to open it to know what it was. The adoption papers. She had known this was coming. Antonio had mentioned it once, weeks ago, in the same way he talked about business deals, practical, precise. She hadn't asked him to do it, hadn't even known how to respond when he brought it up. Now, holding it in her hands, she felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest, a kind of permanence. She swallowed. So that's it? Antonio smirked, leaning back against the counter. That's it. Jane flipped the envelope in her hands. Feels weird. Antonio raised a brow. Weird. She nodded. Yeah, like, things don't just happen like this. No strings attached. No catch. Antonio studied her for a moment before shaking his head. Not this time. Jane let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Not this time. Later that afternoon, she visited Megan. The older woman was still recovering, but the bruises had faded, and the fire in her eyes was very much intact. She sat propped up in bed, a thick quilt draped over her legs, a book resting in her lap. She looked up the moment Jane entered, eyes scanning her as if checking for hidden wounds. You're still too skinny, Megan muttered, setting her book aside. Jane smirked. You're still too nosy. Megan huffed, but gestured for her to come closer. Sit down, girl. I'm not going to yell across the room. Jane sat beside her, shifting awkwardly. She wasn't great at moments like these, the serious kind, the ones where emotions sat heavy in the air, waiting to be acknowledged, but this one mattered. She cleared her throat. I just wanted to say thanks. Megan raised a brow. For what? Jane exhaled, staring at her hands. For fighting for me, for not giving up. She hesitated, then added softer. For caring. Megan was silent for a beat. Then, without warning, she reached over and patted Jane's hand. It was quick, rough, but it meant something. You deserved it, she said simply. Jane swallowed hard. Maybe, and maybe, for the first time she could believe that. That evening, she found Antonio in the garden, standing near the fountain, staring at the sky. The last streaks of sunset bled into the horizon, fading into deep shades of blue. Jane stepped beside him, shoving her hands into her hoodie pockets. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then, quietly, she said, So, I was thinking. Antonio tilted his head slightly, waiting. Maybe we could try making dinner together sometime, she continued. Antonio turned to her with a look of pure skepticism. You realize I can't cook, right? Jane smirked. Yeah, that's why it'll be funny. Antonio chuckled, shaking his head. Fine, but if I burn the house down, it's on you. She shrugged. Deal. Silence stretched between them again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came when words weren't necessary. For most of her life, Jane had been running. From the past. From people. From the fear that if she stayed, she'd be left behind. But now, she was learning something new. She was learning how to stay. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us, and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining.